The same way you're investing in roads and in bridges and in hospitals is the same way you need to be investing in care. It is no longer a nice to have. We have data that shows that care is infrastructure.
Hello, and welcome back to the Work Life Equation. Here we talk about what it takes to thrive at work and in life. And I'm Priya.
And I'm Paul. Today we're joined by Blessing Adesiyan, CEO of the Care Gap and a powerhouse in the global care movement.
Blessing, welcome on the show. We've had the privilege of knowing you and getting to know your work. But as the audience gets to know you, it'll be great for you to talk about your work. It touches so many intersections. It touches care, business, equity, policy. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey and what led you to create the Care Gap?
Oh, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Priya and Paul, for this wonderful platform. I'm always excited when I get, requests to speak, especially on care, because I don't think we talk enough about care, which I believe is the backbone of everything that we do. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, and moved to the US when I was 16. And one of the funniest thing that happened was I did go to school. I did get my chemical engineering degree, but I also graduated with a baby in hand. So it was just quite, I still have my pictures, my graduation pictures, and my daughter Taya is 3 months old and I'm holding her. So I went into the workplace with a very different mindset. My friends, my colleagues were looking at the newest, you know, um, that was when the journals really took off, right? Like the color coding and the things matching. It was really at that time, and everybody was just like, "Have you seen the latest, time management tool, etc." And I'm there like, no, 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 no. What I need is childcare. Okay. What I need is what is the paid leave? What are we doing for working families? And I remember my boss just, literally wide, like his mouth was wide open first day of work when I showed up with my baby in his car seat because the childcare center was going to open at 8 o'clock. I was working at DuPont in West Virginia, and I was told to report to work at 7 a.m. And so I showed up to pick up my badge with my car seats and my baby in there. And I'm like, I just want to pick up my badge. I'm going to go drop her off and I'm going to be right back. And so, after decades of growing up in Nigeria and seeing how tough it was, even for my mother to juggle her own career, as well as raising children, I was basically prepared to have this conversation with my employers around how can we solve for childcare? Because I really want to be productive. I really want to, support my team, but I can't do that without solving for care. And I looked around and I found so many people that were going through exactly the same thing. They were juggling multiple priorities. They were in the PTA, they were in the churches, they were in the schools, they were in the libraries, and they were still juggling, caring for their aging parents or their children. And it was a lot. And so that work at DuPont advocating for families cascaded to so many other things. I started working with HR to create policies at DuPont, then moved on to BASF, and so on and so forth. And I think, that ultimately sparked the Care Gap, which is a platform, a conversation, and a coalition to treat care not as a charity or a woman's burden, but as the backbone of economic and social stability. We cannot have a stable workforce. We cannot have a productive workforce. We cannot have a stable society without care. And I think those companies got it because if you look at where DuPont and BASF and PepsiCo, companies that I worked with, were 16 years ago when Taya was born, and now we've seen them go from 6 weeks of parental leave to 18 weeks of parental leave or 24 weeks. They've added various care infrastructures to support families. And that's because they know that if they don't solve for care, 74% of the workforce who identify as caregivers simply will not have the optimal opportunity to contribute at work.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Blessing. The three of us here, plus, so many of our listeners are juggling, work responsibilities and caregiving responsibilities. And, look, the struggle is that juggle. So when you think about, the impact that that has on, productivity and well-being, both, short term in the workplace, but also, longer term on that individual's mental health. What are some of the things that you found through your work at the Care Gap, and what are some of the things that perhaps companies or individuals can do to make that juggle a little less onerous on their mental health and their productivity?
I think honestly, I'm always like, we don't need to answer these questions over and over again. We know that companies know, companies get it. They know that if they invest in care, that employees will be well supported, that employees will have the tools, the resources, the energy that they need to actually do the work. But companies also know that care is expensive. And that is why they are choosing not to invest in care. But it's also expensive to them even more because care, the lack of care is affecting not just productivity, but also the physical, the emotional, and the mental health of the employee. I'm going to give you an example of, a mom who literally said, I can't walk today. I'm just on my bed. I'm taking the day off, but I'm not going to check out of work. I'm not going to call them and let them know that, I'm taking a day off, but I'm going to literally have my laptop in front of me and just nap in and out. I had a dad call me and said, I am in my car. I just dropped off the kids and I don't want to go into my office. I literally don't want to go into my office because I'm exhausted. I'm physically exhausted. And usually when we think about care, we are thinking about childcare, we're thinking about elder care, but we're not thinking about things like flexibility. We're not thinking about things like, just checking in. We're not thinking about things like, the managers understanding the impact of caregiving on their workforce. That is actually a thing. It's, you have, 75% of your workforce who identify as caregivers. They're caring for someone, something, and you have no idea what they're doing outside of work. You have no idea how much energy is actually going into caring for their children, for their own home, for their own households. And companies are saying, that's not professional. That's none of our business because, you just got to show up at work. Well, it is your business because how they interact with their family, their children, how they manage that is going to heavily support how they actually show up at work. So if that part of their life is chaotic and mismanaged, if they don't know, a lot of families in the United States right now are piecing care together. Like they don't have a sustainable care plan. And so if that is chaotic for 3 or 4 children, I have 4 kids. So you have to like basically play this mental gymnastics. And so companies know that this affects productivity, that it affects physical, mental, and emotional health. They know that women especially are suffering because women are basically carrying and shouldering all of these responsibilities, majority without support from their partners. And we're starting to see 85% of autoimmune diseases in women. We're starting to see women suffering from heart diseases because, quite frankly, I mean, that can cause a lot of damage to your heart when you're constantly worried about your child and whether or not they're in a safe place, whether or not, you need to rush and go pick them up. How many of us have literally ran out of work at 3 p.m. or 2 p.m. rushing to pick up before we get that late fee? So these are the things that families and employees are having to deal with. So I always say, how can companies support? Sometimes it's not even money. Sometimes it's really just having a management that understands the value of care. It's really about checking in and understanding and saying, I know you have 3 kids. How are you managing? Summer is coming up. Is there anything else we can do to support you? When people know that their company cares about them, that their company values care, the energy at work is different. No one is tiptoeing around. I remember when I was in corporate America, I would literally come up with all the lies because I was a single mom. I became a professional liar because, and that is what we are doing to folks. I was a single mom, so I already ran out of excuses that month. And my dad, flew in from Nigeria and he fell suddenly. And we found out that he had a brain tumor. So I'm running around trying to, piece together his MRI, his appointments, all of the things, plus being a single mom. So I ran out of excuses. So I had to come up with more. And one of the days my boss saw me tiptoeing out and was like, I've been noticing. And I was like, yeah, I've been asking for support. I've been literally crying and begging for support. And he finally called a meeting and said, you know what? We need to give you we need to make sure that you can. This was way before it was time, it was, this flexible era that we are in now. This was way before COVID. And he said, you know what? You need to work from home for the next 2 weeks until you at least sort out this MRI issue, understand your dad's diagnosis, and get the support that you need. And that was very, very helpful to me because I didn't have to sit in traffic in Houston for 2 hours in a day trying to get to work. So these are some of the things. It's not just money, it's also having a care culture within the organization. So, and when we have that care culture, when we then have the money, we can then say, how else can we support? Can we offer childcare? Can we offer aging care? Can we offer credits? Can we support families differently so that those people can bring their best self to work?
Just a quick follow up on that. That manager who took the lead and realized that you needed support, was that manager responding to some sort of care policy at that company? Or did that manager just realize that this is what was going on? And as a good manager, as a decent human being, that the thing to do was to create this policy that allowed you to work from home for 2 weeks until you got a little bit further along on what was happening?
Yes, at the time there was no care policy. I know, Paul, you advocate a lot for care days, which I find, intriguing because I think that's what I would have needed at that point in my life. So the manager was basically like, we have to figure something out. Like we can't lose you because I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna just take a break and maybe go find another job. I was a chemical engineer, and I mean, I would find another job in no time. And so it was like, we have to work something out with you. But there was no policy at the time. And so what has happened in some organizations is that they've put in place care policies. We work with companies like Indeed that have basically said we have to create care policies so that employees know that we have their back when life happens, when they have to expand their family, when there are transitions, when their family members get sick, when kids have to, when you have to go attend to a special needs, for example. That is another angle that we've never explored, in our institutions, is that families actually do have a wide range of diseases and illnesses that needs to be, that we need to care for. It's not just childcare, it's not just elder care, it's all the things that are in between. It's like a spectrum of things, of care related issues that comes up that we need to basically solve for before they happen. Because when it's happening, nobody, like the manager is trying to get things done and the employee doesn't have the time. So at the end of the day, it's still a time issue, right? We run into a situation where there's time poverty at that point for the employee to pour into their work. And the manager is saying, I need that time. I need that time. But if we have some policies in place where we're like, okay, when these happens, where else do we create time? We can create time with another employee. We can create time with another department. We have, a backup plan for this. And we're able to pull into those backup plans to help meet that employee's needs. So that is what I would love to see. Paul, you mentioned, what are some of the things I would love to see companies do? It's a care culture, it's care policies, it's making sure that there's a backup plan. Because when you have 3 out of 4 employees with serious caregiving responsibilities, you cannot leave that up for discussion. You can rely on you have no strategy at that point. You can rely on, oh, let's just, hope that you won the manager lottery. Right? I happened to have won the manager lottery at that point. It could have gone the other way. It could have been like, you know what, guess what? You're fired. Get out of here. Right? And so that is why policies are important, because we can't leave it to the manager. We can't leave it to the individual.
And I think, and it's great that you both had a supporting manager and you were vocal about it, Blessing, because I think it's both employers and employees. And through COVID, certainly, as in our role in Bright Horizons, we saw a lot of companies step up and do more. So the good thing is during that period, because we saw work and life merge in the way that it did, or at least become visible. I think companies stepped up to do a lot more. And then we discovered flexibility. We realized like a workforce could be productive remotely. A workforce could be productive. This artificial construct of 9 to 5 could actually be challenged, and people could work 9 to 3. go pick up their kids and still clock back in. So I do think there have been some unlocks. Have you seen that play itself out? Uh, and are there things that you've seen change in the 16 years since you took your little one out of the, in the car seat into work? What have you seen change, and what are the good things that have come out, as a result of both COVID and your own work?
Absolutely. I think one of the good things that has happened is just we're having more conversations about it. When the 16 years ago, it was osh osh. It was like, oh no, you don't talk about your kid. We weren't talking about our kids, at work or in meetings. Everything you're supposed to keep everything osh osh. If you're going to pick up your kids, you can't even talk about it. Now we have people even putting on calendars, to say, okay, today's football day, or I'm going to leave work early. So we're seeing some shift there. And that doesn't mean that people aren't getting penalized. A lot of people are still getting penalized for being vocal and for making care visible. Right. And so, I always say, if you feel like you don't have the voice, you don't have, the tools to speak at the time, the best thing to do is really send an email. Send an email, state this problem, and just leave it there. Do not have any, there's no ask, there's no request, but just let your employer or somebody know that this is happening, and and you just want to share that. So that's one. The other piece is a lot has changed, but unfortunately, change has been extremely slow. And the reason change has been extremely slow is because we still live in a society that truly believes that this work is a woman's work. Truly believes that if a child, if you're pregnant, you give birth to a child, if it's breastfeeding, if you are having to drop off the child at daycare, you need a nanny, it is still a woman's job. Summer camp time. I mean, around this time, everyone is agitated. Those who won the lottery to get a spot are happy. And those of us that are still like, oh my God, I have 3 or 4 kids. We have to do all the different drive around town for each child. How is that going to work? And summer camp is from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. What's going to happen to work around those hours? So we're looking at a situation where women still get the short end of the stick. So not a lot has changed. What has changed is we're having conversations. Unfortunately, the more we have the conversation, the more pushback we're getting. The more it feels like we're asking for too much. The more it feels like, well, we can't, this is not infrastructure. This is just a nice to have. This is not, it's not really, where is the ROI? I remember when we were trying to sell to companies, it was almost a joke. I got tired, right? Because you start talking and the next thing is, what is the ROI? What is the this and that? Go come up with the numbers. Why we need to make it look good so that we can sell this. And I'm like, look, are we asking for companies to come up with ROIs when it's time to build a road from the power plant all the way to the city so that employees can get to work? I worked in Parkersburg, West Virginia, in the middle of nowhere. DuPont was responsible for building that road. That is infrastructure. No one is asking for ROI for those things. So we need to start thinking about care as infrastructure for families. Again, if you have 75% of your workforce depending on care, providing care, then you need to think about, how can I make care available so that these people can actually work? It's the same way we need roads to get to work. It's the same way we build bridges. It's the same way we need hospitals in strategic locations so that we can get sick people attended to in the right amount of time. That is how valuable care is to every one of us. So it's still very confusing to me that we have to, sort of prove. That is what has changed. Is this need to prove how much money care can add to you as a company? But the way we need to thinking about it is care as capital, is care as infrastructure. We need to actively be thinking of setting aside enough money for care. It should be baked into the budget. This is not something that is nice to have. It is something that is important to have. Because if those families cannot get to work because there's a hiccup, there's disruptions in care. Look at COVID. That was when we all knew how important it was, when there was massive disruption. And we were all like, oh my God, we didn't realize care was infrastructure. Oh my God, everybody was running around losing their minds. Dads were hiding in the bathroom because they didn't want to do care work. Moms were losing their minds. I know that I just got in the car and just drove for like 30 miles because I was exhausted from all the care work. And my husband kept calling. I'm like, you know what, go deal with your 4 kids. And so that is the reality when we think or we believed that care wasn't infrastructure. And then we realized during COVID that care was infrastructure. And then we decided not to do anything about it because guess what? Women will continue to do this work for free.
The infrastructure framing is a really interesting one. My father-in-law was a nuclear he was a nuclear scientist, so he created townships around nuclear power plants and everything that you're saying, right? Which is how do you build hospitals? How do you build roads? How do you build schools? Is a really important aspect of saying this township needs to come together. It is a community that comes. So it's the euphemistic village to both raise your children and your community as you're flourishing. The role of the employer versus the government versus the employee is something that we've continued to debate. So, in your policy work, how has that worked out? How do you see the role of employer versus the government versus the employee, and whose role ends and begins where? Because we've seen different countries do this differently. There are countries in Europe who think of this as infrastructure, but certainly that's not the case in the US. So, what are you seeing? And again, in terms of shifting trend lines, is there something we should be excited about?
Absolutely. So I think that, when I think about care, the first word that comes to mind when a mom or a dad or anyone comes to me and say, Blessing, oh my God, I'm drowning in care. I'm being crushed under the burden of care. The first thing I basically, the first word that comes out of my mouth is redistribution.
Mm.
Care is something that shouldn't be shouldered alone. It's not something that I take on. It's not something that my husband takes on 100%. In fact, I always joke with my husband that, this shared responsibility conversation that we are having, that this conversation is really and truly, oh my goodness, my kids are here. I'm going to have to answer this question again. So when I think about care, the first thing I think about is redistribution. When a mom or a dad or if or anyone comes to me and say I'm being crushed under the burden of care, I always think about redistribution, and that's the first thing I tell them. You need to redistribute the care. My husband and I, we joke a lot that the work is even too much for two people. So even when we talk about shared responsibility, I look at my four kids and I'm like, there's no way we can do this alone and have a career. So we still need to redistribute. And so where do we need to redistribute that care? We redistribute it to individuals. So whether that is my partner, my husband, or my wife, whether that is aunt, neighbors, grandma, grandpa that is around, that those are the first people that we want to redistribute that care to. Then we need to think of markets, the bright horizons of the world. What is the market doing to solve for care, and who are the people that I can go to for care support? Three, institutions. That's our market. That's our workplaces. Those are churches. I always say churches, religious institutions. These are places that really and truly should be solving for care. If we're collecting tithes, we're collecting all this different support from our congregation, then we should be able to provide care. A lot of churches have, nurseries. They have, the Sunday schools. Well, can we utilize those places for care? Then the fourth place we need to look at is the government. The government should be treating care as a catalyst for economic growth. If I want my workforce to actually go to work, and not come up with excuses, not say, oh my God, I can't come today because my child is sick. I can't come tomorrow because we don't have childcare. I really can't. We're never going to get anything done. So the government needs to be looking at care as an economic catalyst that will support all the targets that they have. The same way you're investing in in roads and in bridges and in hospitals is the same way you need to be investing in care. It is no longer a nice to have. We have data that shows that care is infrastructure. It is not let's just see. Because what has happened is women have done the work for free, and we did not include care in the GDP of a country. We looked at all the different sectors. We looked at agriculture. We looked at banking. We looked at all these different things. We said, these are economic activities. Let's add them to the GDP. Well, care, you know what? Women are doing that work. Let's just leave that. That's behind the scenes. Well, it's no longer behind the scenes because we have more and more women in the workforce. We have women contributing to the economy. So women are no longer strictly care providers. So we need to start treating care as a visible economic engine. And so when we say whose responsibility is it? Is it the government or the employer? I say both. I say everyone. And so governments can introduce care subsidies. They can provide universal childcare, universal aging care. They can support persons with disabilities. Employers can support all of their employees with care credits. They can support all of their employees with proper paid leave so that they can use those days for emergencies like I had with my dad and not have to tiptoe out of work. So it is a collective responsibility that I'm hoping, we've never stopped talking about it because we are seeing very clearly that this is no longer a nice to have. And so we are being very bold in just going straight for the money and saying, look, this is infrastructure. You don't pay for it. Guess what? The world is expanding. We're having more and more. I'm just going to give you an example. Nigeria is on track to be the third largest country in the world by 2040. I think India and China are the first two. And so you're looking at more and more children, more and more people getting older. Who is going to take care of them? Because if we're still relying on women, we have missed the boat because my daughters are not going to do that. A lot of us we have young kids. We know they're not going to do that. We didn't do that. I'm here talking to you. Priya, you're wearing a nice suit. You're not going to do that. So who is going to take care of, the babies and the aging adults? We have to solve for care and we need to solve for it strategically.
I want to pick up on that blessing, the strategic part, and kind of blend in. I love the idea of redistribution, and of course, we were talking about the manager lottery. But if we think of, companies, and in your experience, sort of what the best companies have done here, if it's something that I'm not saying these things are easy to solve, but they're solvable in a prescriptive way. If, for example, you don't have enough employees signing up for their 401k plan, you can build in incentives, get them to sign up more. If you want to put in place an equitable parental leave policy, you can look around and say, okay, well, we're going to give 20 weeks to men, 20 weeks to women. We'll have a policy in place before they go out on leave, a policy in place when they return. That's fine. Even if, you have an office in an out of the way place and there isn't great infrastructure, you can put a cafeteria in there and feed them so they don't have to wander off and spend an hour getting lunch. But when it comes to sort of, the I don't want to say soft, but the sort of less predictable things, I'm wondering what companies can do. And by that, I mean, you could give a caregiver, parental leave. You could give them 3, 4, 5, 6 months. You could then bring in a Bright Horizons to help with on-site childcare up until they go off to school. But from 5 to 18 to 22, all kinds of things happen with kids. We all know as parents of older children, they can get sick. They can just need, mom or dad for a moment. They could have a health crisis, any number of things. How can companies help in that space where it is, less clearly defined as to what might be needed at a specific time, but you still know that there's a need there that's going to arise? What have, companies done specifically that you've seen to sort of benefit folks in that age range?
And I think I can also certainly add in terms of how what we're seeing, because it's an interesting trend. But blessing, it is an important question on how ages and stages change and what supports are. You have 4 kids who are from 3 through 16. So how has that changed for you?
I mean, I think honestly, things happen, life happens the same way, companies are planning for 401k, people go in and they grab it. I've grabbed for my 401k before. There's always, pulls and push when it comes to these things anyways. But I think that we can still solve strategically for these things. A very good example was when I was working in one of the, Fortune 100 companies that I worked with. And our manager, I was very surprised, was like, you know what? Everybody's working Monday through Thursday. That wasn't a company policy. He just came up with that policy by himself. It was like, our team is working Monday through Thursday. Because he said, I don't work on Fridays. Fridays are the days that I use to solve for any of my care related issues. I use that to do any errands, any school lunches with my kids, etc. I was very, very surprised. And that manager and I became best buddies because of that. Because guess what? We would literally heads down Monday through Thursday, and Friday we're just on phones. And those were the Fridays that I did my laundry. Those were the Fridays that I, had lunch with my daughter at school. Those were the Fridays that I had my doctor's appointments, all of the things. So we actually had more people working Monday through Thursday, versus somebody just coming with, because what you'll find is a lot of these things, when it happens, because you know that there's no solution, there's no flexibility, you just want to take that time off right there and then. Sometimes you can actually just be like, you know what? We will deal with this. This is happening on a Wednesday. Maybe a child needs to, or a husband needs to go to the doctor. Oh, this is happening on Wednesday. Well, guess what? I'm just gonna wait till Friday to go to the. I'm just making it up. I'm just gonna go to this event on Friday versus going now, right? And so when people know that there's somewhat of a structure, that is why companies put structures in place. It's not because things are not going to go wrong. It's because there's something to fall back on. There's something to say, okay, this is our standard operating procedure. This is how we actually do things. So when we have something like a Friday off, or we have flexibility built in, where people can actually use that flexibility to work. And this, we saw this during COVID, when we were like, okay, you know what? As long as we're all online between 10 to 2 p.m., right? Whatever you now do outside of that, as long as your work is done, well, you're fine. But as long as you're at work from 10 to 2, you're good. So people used those openings to breast pump, to breastfeed, to go pump, to do various things. And it's not because these things, life is happening, but there is some structure in place. And so what my pushback to employers who are like, well, this is not really standardized, is that you can actually standardize something. You can actually put some kind of structure in place. You can say, you know what, on Fridays, we don't have physical meetings. Maybe don't declare Friday as a day off, but on Fridays, we don't have physical meetings. Any meetings that happen on Friday is a virtual meeting. So that if people are at a doctor's appointment, if people have to, go pick up their kids early from school, we know Fridays, usually it's early pickup. They can put their headphones on and they can still pick up their kids. So I think that a lot of companies, just need to put structures in place. We are, when it comes to care, suddenly we are lazy. Suddenly there are all these red tapes. Suddenly, oh my goodness, this is a risk that we can't take. But if this was a 401k, if this was, something that is, that is a risk exposure to the company, suddenly there are structures, there are processes. But if we take care, as again, like I said, if we value care as something that our employees need, that is absolutely important to them, but something that we as a company, if we see it as what, as a company, we also need this to get the most out of our employees, then we will put some kind of structure in place. And that structure will help a lot of people that, tend to fall outside of this, the lines. They will come in very quickly. And yes, you will still have things that happen outside of the box, but you will realize that people will take advantage of those Fridays, or people will take advantage of those flexibilities and still do their best work, or even perform at a higher level.
And yeah, the notion of sort of saying, employees are adults and they will work responsibly is really critical. And flexibility. And to your earlier point, Paul, I mean, we've seen this with employers, and I sit in the half glass full sort of category when, we've seen 5 generations in the workforce. Yeah, summers came about. Yes, Bright Horizons provides childcare, but as we have a more aging population, we're certainly seeing more and more employers lean into elder care. We operate as a camps company, and more employers leaning into saying, how do we provide school age supports for kids who are under the age of 12, college supports, etc. So I do see employers leaning in, not for 3 reasons. I would say one is the fact that it is a changing demographic. The second is that the workforce is getting more vocal. Fathers are getting more vocal, moms are getting more vocal. And the third is, COVID sort of normalized that conversation. And so there was a little bit of a reckoning. I want to flip that question a little bit, Blessing, and ask you, what happens when employers don't lean into this? What have you seen as the downside of employers who've said, no, this is not, work and life are separate. You are the 8 hours that you're in the office. What has happened in those scenarios, and are there lessons that others could take from that?
I think the first thing is we see women drop off, and we saw that, during COVID, when care became too intense. women tend to drop out of the workforce at that point. So we find that a lot of those employers are unable to retain women in the workforce. They are also unable to retain, men that want to step into care. I think gone are the days when we thought dads weren't, capable of care. So a lot of women now know that dads are capable. So you do your part. So that's one. And then gone are the days when we thought that men would just accept, that they didn't need to talk about their kids and they didn't need to go home and go, for football practice and support their partners and, be home for dinner. Gone are those days too. So we're finding that a lot of those companies are also losing, well-meaning men. Men that, wanting to have that equity in their own households. A lot of them, we're seeing more and more women earning more. And so a lot of them are looking at their paychecks the same way companies are looking at, I always say this is a numbers game, right? It's really a numbers game. So when you then see couples say, look, this is my salary, this is your salary, somebody needs to come home on time. Somebody needs to be the one to pick up the kids. There was a day that I had a meeting with one of a large funder, and we were supposed to pick up the kids. And my kids have two, they're spread across three different schools. And normally my husband handles drop off, I handle pick up. I said, you know what? You're handling both. And he, at first he was like, oh no, I'm gonna be at work, I'm gonna be doing X, Y, and Z. I said, well, this meeting is with this and that, this and that. It was like, say what? You know what? I will be right there. It's like they know more. And so these are the conversations. So I always tell employers, you need to pay attention to what is happening on the home front. You can't have a work front that works optimally by ignoring what is happening on the home front. It's really just not going to work anymore. So if employers are paying attention to what men and women are doing at home, they will realize very quickly that, quite frankly, a lot of those men jetting out early these days, they are going to pick up their kids. They are also going to make dinner. They are not, I think a lot of companies are operating under the basis that women are the one doing this work still. And what they will find out very quickly, and I hope they find out sooner rather than later, is that men are stepping into this work and men will also do it because at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. It's a numbers game for the company. It's a numbers game for the man. It's a numbers game for the woman. So this is why we need to look at this. We need to basically all come back and look at these numbers and this data and these statistics and say we have to make it easy for everybody, all employees, male or female, and even the workforce to value care. We all just need to come to the table and realize that care is something the same way. I don't know if you all remember, this was about 15, 16 years ago when the workplace was just a crazy place, especially in the manufacturing environment that I was in. People, there was a lot of, just anyhowness is what I call it, things flying back and forth between men and women. There was different harassment and things like that, people being disrespectful. And they launched, respect for people across board. We were having mindset and behaviors. We were having respect for people training. We were having all sort of things. And I feel like we are at that junction with companies. We need to have a care culture sensitization. Everybody needs to understand the value of care, not just to the employee, but also to the company. So the next time that manager goes into the performance review and, it's like, you know what, Blessing has been pregnant, twice now in the last 4 years. I don't think it's time for a promotion. Another VP should step up and say, no, that is unacceptable here. We are a caring company. We will not accept that from you.
Blessing, you're obviously you're singing my tune at the company of dads, and how we always talk about lead dads as men being super involved versus event dads who just show up for events. But your story about men being more vocal reminds of a guest that we had on last season, Dr. Dana Suskin, who told this story, this wonderful story about her husband, who they had 3 kids, 3 daughters, who would was leaving early to go see their kids do something. And he was the chief pediatric surgeon at the University of Chicago Hospital. And he made something up to put in his calendar. He made something up that he was having a high level meeting with Dr. So-and-so, knowing that Dr. So-and-so would never see it. And then he would sneak out. And one day he does this and he sneaks out. and he runs into one of his residents. Residents should be wildly deferential to the chief surgeon. The resident is pretty cheeky, comes up to him and says, "So, is this your high level meeting with Dr. So and so?" And he's like, and that was a moment of change for him. And this is, again, like you're saying, 12, 15 years ago. Um, and we are slowly moving along. But I want to talk more about sort of your own evolution. As you know, I'm a super fan of yours, Blessing. And, I've seen, started with Mother Honestly. Mother Honestly became MH Work Life. That evolved into the Care Gap. Part of the Care Gap is Caring Africa. And now, you've really gone from the individual, and that story you tell when you started Mother Honestly, and all those women, all those moms showed up, to working with companies, now to be working with governments and NGOs and really pushing for systemic change. And you're one of the smartest people I know in the care economy. What drove that evolution, and how do you see what you're doing now, pushing for that systemic change, cascading down to companies and individuals who really need that help with care?
Wow, great question. I think one of the things that I always joke around is you just have to be, an immigrant, a chemical engineer, and a mother of four, and all of those things. I think, honestly, I think for me, it was, just starting out, thinking that I was the problem. And then realizing that, wow, I'm not alone. There's so many other women that are going through this. And then speaking to those women and realizing that, ooh, this is not a woman's issue. This is a workforce issue. This is a workplace issue. This is a government issue. And then, shifting into advocacy. And then looking at, during my advocacy work, looking at policies and realizing that, wow, we really did not plan for care. We planned for everything else. And we really just ignored care because we've always just, thought that somebody else was managing this. Well, that somebody else has been crushed and is crying out for survival. And so we have to shift this care burden and redistribute this care. And I think it was that haha moment when I realized that care wasn't, it wasn't a woman's issue. It wasn't even just the government's issue. Care was everybody's issue. And so the conversation then evolved from being an individual issue to everyone's issue. And so I like to think of, the work that I do now as more of, looking at the ecosystem and saying, how can we make sure that everybody, does their fair share? How do we make sure that everyone does their fair share? How do we make sure workplaces can step into care without feeling like, oh my God, we're just supporting? A lot of time when I go into workplaces and, the HR people, they're always trying to, be saying, they're like, oh my God, like, this is just really amazing. She's helping women. And I'm like, no, 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 nah, we're not helping women. This is economic value. This is business value, right? So coming into a new space for me where I'm thinking about this from an ecosystem perspective. I'm thinking about this from an institutional perspective, looking at economies and seeing what is common. So a very good example is recently in Bogota, Colombia, in Kenya, and in India, we are looking at care policies, national care policies, looking at policies and saying, look, if we actually just go straight to the government and we can incubate national care policies, the same way we have the Labor Act, can we have the Care Act? Can we have a care agenda for nations that really just says, look, in order for us to meet all of this economic and infrastructural goals that we have for our nation, we need to solve for care. We need to make sure children, adults, the care workforce, for example, is a workforce that nobody cares about. It's invisible. Nobody sees them. It's like, who is doing your laundry right now? Who is, out there, making sure that there's always a babysitter? No one is looking at that workforce. So we're not looking at, okay, how do we take this and understand that this is a systemic issue? This is not an individual issue. Dad and mom are out there fighting, thinking, oh, you didn't pick up, you didn't drop off, it's because you didn't do X, Y, and Z. Well, really, it is a systemic issue. If we have just solved for this on a societal level, then dad and mom can really just focus on having their best life, taking care of their children, spending more time with their kids, and doing their best work. So the work has, like you said, evolved. What we are doing now is really looking at care, solving for care through technology, right? Through media, storytelling. These things are powerful. Solving for care through policy and advocacy, knowing that the only way for this to actually be to be solved systematically and the only way for us to solve this systematically and strategically is actually to change policies. We can't do anything without changing policies. That is why we push for policies in the workplace. That is why we push for policies on the government level. Because quite frankly, if we leave it to the individual, nothing is going to get done. So yes, Paul, you're absolutely right. And I think, what has made it possible is really just my problem solving spirit. I think whether it's from my years of being an engineer and just really looking at an issue and saying, how do we solve for this, and not just get the result that we need, but how do we actually make sure that we go to the root cause and we solve from this issue bottom up. And it's not just, oh, we're just gonna throw out some things and throw out some solutions, but actually fundamentally change how we all value care, and that we all understand the value of that care to our homes, to our workplaces, to our institutions, and to our economy. I think when everybody understands that, we had this conversation with I went to a meeting with the IFC, with the International Finance Corporation, and they said, Blessing, we want to look at, can you help us with our gender strategy for 2025 to 2030? And I looked at everything, and they said, we're looking at women empowerment, we're looking at trainings, we're looking at skills. And I said, well, this is all great. And at the same time, this is appalling, because you all have done this for the past 20 years. And in 20 years, we've widened the gender gap. Nothing has changed. In fact, we've made matters worse. And one of the reasons we've made matters worse is because we are not looking at the biggest impact to women's well-being, to women's careers. There's no woman that can scale a business without care. I mean, you can put all the laptops, all the training and power, do all the things that you want to do with that woman. But when she gets home and her husband says, where's my dinner? Why are the kids dirty? Why have you not changed their diapers? So we have to solve for care. And so when they started thinking about these things from that level, understanding that there's a systemic issue out there that we need to solve for before we can even look at all the empowerment, all the trainings, all the things, and also looking at how men can step into care more properly, because that is another big issue that I think is the biggest opportunity that we have. Even when we look at the four domains that I spoke about, right? Which is the individual, the institutions, the markets, and the government. Who are the people operating and leading those domains? They are men. So the more men I can get to value care, the more I can change the perception of care in those places, in those domains. The more men that can push for paid leave, the more men that can push for childcare, the more men in workplaces saying, you know what, the next time you see a proposal from Bright Horizons or any other market provider, please approve it. The more men I can get to do that, the better the society will become.
And I can certainly, I mean, from a marketplace standpoint, the narrative that we're collectively trying to drive is to say there is health and well being, there is financial well being, and this is personal well being, right? The care economy is personal well being, which is really your narrative to say that don't separate the human from their responsibilities. If you want people to be productive, you need to look after their whole self, and care is very much part of that whole self. Well, Blessing, we can talk for hours about everything that you're doing and all the great work that you're accomplishing. More power to you as you navigate this across these various environments. Thank you so much for being here with us and for sharing your voice, your story, and your mission, and your continued evolution to see how you can drive change across various levels. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
And Blessing, this is a thrill to be talked to, as always, but it's a real reminder for our listeners, the importance of your work, and a reminder too that the care is not a burden. It's a cornerstone for the future of the economy we're hoping to develop. So thank you again for being our guest today. I thought I loved, her labeling, the manager lottery. Like early on, she won the manager lottery. And our first guest this season was Suba Berry, who also talked about the importance of those managers stepping in. And that's wonderful when it happens for those individuals. But I think both Blessing and Suba are trying to find ways to institutionalize that, trying to make it so that companies can have policies that, as you talked about, support the kids at all stages of their life, or support the worker, at all stages of their caregiving journey. And when you institutionalize that, you don't have to hope you get lucky and win the manager lottery. You can say, like, okay, my employer sees that there's, value here. And that comes back to our whole conversation around infrastructure and redistribution, how we sort of bake it into, what a company is doing for it's, as she said, this isn't about moms or dads. It's about, economic benefit.
Yeah, and we've heard so many of our guests in the past talking about role modeling. When you spoke about Dana Suskin, her husband role modeling this is really critical. So I don't know, when you have a family where both individuals work, I think there's a different empathy. So this notion of this balance between culture and policy, a caring culture as an organization, redistribution as a principle, and the redistribution between the individual, employer, government, and within the family itself. And then the third element around, return on infrastructure, that was my takeaway, was like, treat this as infrastructure, treat this as the long-term investment for prosperity of an economy, of a society, and of humans in general. How do you create a culture which is caring? And then how do you create policies that scaffold them and don't allow things to fall through the cracks? It was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, it was a great talk.
And to all of you tuning in, thank you for listening to the Work-Life Equation, brought to you by Prairie Horizons.
We'll be back next month with more conversations about how to thrive in all parts of your life. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.